Just the right kind of weather for you to sit inside in the dark and listen to a lecture. I'm hoping that more people will show up because it's such a special occasion. Of course, I should introduce myself. My name is Ike Kong, and I'm the Deputy Director and Chief Curator here at the museum. And this is Art Matters, a lecture series destined for people just like you who are interested in the history of art and continuing adult education. And we're so fortunate to have Gülru here. She teaches at Amherst, which is in the Boston area, so she flew all the way out here. But it's a special occasion, particularly because she's the guest curator of the current special exhibition upstairs, Out of Storage and Into the Light, Sculptures That Tell Stories. So this week was the first time she got a chance to see her own installation because we worked on this together remotely on the whole. And so it was a real process, the selection of the objects and then how they were laid out and displayed. All of this was done mostly through email and images with me and my crew. So I think it was a nice and hopefully pleasant surprise for her to actually see the installation. And hopefully you've all had a chance to go upstairs and see the exhibition, yes? So you know that the content is very rich. And as I told Gülru, the difficult thing in trying to speak about this show is to keep it to an hour even because there's just so much content. But that's exactly what she's going to do. Just as a few other words of preamble, I've known Gülru for a long time because I met her when she was a young and aspiring graduate student at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. And I had the pleasure of working with her on many projects when I was at the Walters, and she was certainly my favorite assistant. And she's blossomed into a truly exceptional art historian who's winning lots of awards and critical acclaim. She published her dissertation on Gérôme just a little while ago. Beautiful book. I urge you to go out and buy it. But she's also branched out into sculpture. And that's a truly valuable thing in our discipline because art history, as we keep on lamenting, is a somewhat dying humanity right now. But certainly sculpture has been a long neglected medium, largely in favor of 2D matter. We seem to like flat paintings, and we certainly like digital images these days. But sculpture has its own special properties, and so it was a real, I think, opportunity to call attention to the specific medium in an exhibition like this one, which truly is a little bit rare to see in most museums. But with that, I'm going to give Gülru ample time. She has about 45 slides to share with you, and lots and lots and lots of stories. If you want to hold your questions until the end, I'm sure she'd be happy to entertain some. If you're bursting with a question and you want to interrupt her, I'm sure she can deal with that too. But please join me in welcoming her to the stage.
Thank you, Ike, for this introduction. It's wonderful to be here, and yes, thank you for coming out on this Sunday. It's a great pleasure for me to have participated in this project with Ike, and I thank you very much for inviting me and opening up her storage to me and just giving me basically carte blanche. So I hope you will enjoy the exhibition. So I want to thank Ike, but also I want to thank her fantastic team for making this exhibition possible. Michelle West, curatorial assistant, has been amazing in helping me go through the files, helping me understand what these objects are about. And Philip Lord, who installed the exhibition, has done an amazing job. And I don't know whether you get a chance to look at the 3D models that you can play with in the exhibition galleries, but the IT team did a wonderful job of actually generating those 3D models. So even though unfortunately we cannot touch the sculptures with these 3D models, we can have a sort of a digital handling experience with them. Now, I titled my talk today with a question: what do sculptures do? Now, I need to preface what I'm going to share with you today by adding that, as we shall see, the answer to the question what sculptures do is that actually in very many of the cases we just do not know. In particular, sculptures of prehistoric periods give us very little to work with. Who these people were, what language they spoke, what belief systems shaped their worldviews have all been lost irrevocably. At the expense of uttering a platitude, I will dare say that they're silent witnesses to a bygone past, of which they are most often the only material remains. Just a quick view of the installation itself. Now, a case in point is one of the smallest pieces in our exhibition, a tiny head around 3.5 inches tall. Created about 4,500 years ago, this head is actually a fragment. It once had a body. It was made on one of the 220 islands constituting the Cyclades archipelago on the Aegean Sea between modern-day Greece and Turkey, carved out of marble which was copiously found on the islands. Now, scholars have argued for the presence of a pan-Cycladic culture across these isles, uniting multiple small communities on several islands through a shared material culture. By the same token, the broad geographical dispersal of the Cyclades seems to have promoted distinct local and inter-regional networks of contact and interaction, leading to regional differentiation in various aspects of the material culture among these islands. There is much that we do not know about this complex culture. Since the late 19th century, hundreds of sculptures similar to this piece have been unearthed, and many have found their way into private and public collections. They often come without detailed provenance information, signaling that they were not discovered in scientifically conducted archaeological excavations. The fragment in our exhibition belongs to a subset of early Bronze Age sculptures made on the Cyclades after 2700 BC. Varying in size from small figurines a few inches tall that fit the palm of a hand to fully life-size statues, the majority of the extant pieces are around 12 inches in height. This puts our figurine, whose full height I speculate to be around 15 inches, toward the larger end of the spectrum. Despite differences in size, the pieces demonstrate a stylistic continuum and consistency, proving that there was a canonical form, as well as established procedures of making that were closely followed by their creators. That being said, some scholars have tried to trace hands of individual makers, styles of different individual makers, although this has created some controversy. So, talking about this canonical form, what are some of the features of this canonical form? In order to answer this question, I would like us to take a quick look at the historical predecessors. Around 2,000 years prior to the making of our piece, Neolithic inhabitants of the region had carved portly female forms out of marble, as we see in the image on the left. These were naturalistically modeled female bodies with exaggerated buttocks and bellies. And then, sometime around the 3rd millennium, we see the gradual emergence of a new type that would become canonical. In the middle photograph, we see a very nice example of this type, named the plastrous type after the site of a cemetery on the Paros Island. If a memory of the Neolithic corpulent naturalism remains, that is in the broad hips of this figure. The rest has become schematic and abstracted, with an unnaturally long neck and an overall violin-shaped body. It is interesting to note that representations of male figures also appear around this period. When we finally come to the style that would be fully established in another 300 to 500 years, by 2700 BC, we see that a few interesting things have happened, which we can see in the image on the right. For one thing, the arms are neatly folded across the chest, earning it the name the folded arm figure. In some of the figurines, such as in the example on the screen, its protruding belly seems to indicate pregnancy. The legs are no longer separately articulated but distinguished by a deep incision. It is to this final type that our Santa Barbara figurine belongs. The most prominent feature on the face is a triangular nose. The elongated forehead tapers, and the head is gently tilted back. The Cycladic folded arm figurines, with their schematic and flattened bodies, clean lines, and stylized forms, were embraced by modernist artists in the early 20th century, influencing figures such as Constantin Brancusi, Amedeo Modigliani, and others. Our familiarity with the conventions of looking at modern art shouldn't color our judgment, however. We are fundamentally ignorant of the context, function, and uses of the cyclic figurines. We do have some clues, though. The one striking feature of this type is that, with its knees bent and toes pointing, it simply cannot stand on its own. This has led some scholars to speculate that we are not looking at a standing figure, but a reclining one, a posture that would have been more convenient for a funeral offering to be laid down in a tomb. There are a few pieces in our exhibition which indeed had a function related to funerary rituals. The large female figure from northwest Mexico, made 2 millennia after the Cycladic figures, was probably deposited in a tomb alongside other offerings. Such ancient sculptural figurines from West Mexican tombs participated in a widespread custom of furnishing tombs of dominant families with elaborate offerings. The deceased would be covered with textiles and shell jewelry and surrounded by an array of food vessels, obsidian artifacts, and ceramic figurines such as the one we see on the screen. Scholars have suggested that the reason these figurines, representing various segments of the society, were placed in the tomb of important personages was that perhaps, even after they died, these dead leaders would continue to intercede on the part of their people, for example, to secure the regular succession of the seasons, the fertility of the soil, and abundant harvest in the domain of the spirits. Now, returning to our Cycladic culture, we do not have enough information at hand to discern whether these figurines similarly had key roles to play in the ancestor cult. Those that have been discovered by archaeologists in situ have been predominantly located in cemeteries, often buried alongside other objects. And yet, more recent archaeological digs have revealed copious presence of these figurines beyond cemeteries, and found traces of them in everyday contexts, such as in the stone foundations of dwellings. And their function was neither exclusively limited to the everyday or to the afterlife. They also seem to have existed in the in-between spaces of life and death. For example, an archaeological team discovered on the tiny island of Keros a site that consisted exclusively of fragments of previously broken sculptures. This has been a rather puzzling discovery, for it looks like these fragments were brought here to be buried together, although the site is not a cemetery. Other discoveries have located these figurines in the thresholds of doors, suggesting that they may have had protective or talismanic powers. What we do know is that beyond functioning solely as tomb offerings accompanying the dead in the afterlife, they seem to have had lives in the world of their makers before being buried underground. One of the most significant observations scholars have made has been traces of paint on the surface of these sculptures. This figurine, for example, has a number of vertical lines painted in red across its chest. Researchers have identified traces of such linear motifs on the faces of some of the other figures as well. One theory, just a theory, is that these long vertical marks may evoke scratches made on the face, the color red referring to the blood that runs out of them. Face scratching has a long history as a gesture, as an act of mourning. Perhaps some of these statues functioned to grieve over the dead person. One painted motif that has been discovered in abundance is the motif of the eye. I'm right now showing you some of the reconstructions some scholars have proposed. As we can see, these two figures have a number of eyes, not only on their faces, but also on their thighs, bellies, and necks. In considering such examples, we may be allowed to think that these sculptures were painted multiple times in their lifetimes. There are many unanswered questions. For example, looking at the unnaturalistic multiple eye motifs dispersed around the body, or repeated several times on the face, we wonder whether these were made all at the same time, or alternately whether the repainting happened on different occasions. If the piece was repainted on different occasions, did that happen when the older pigments wore out, or would the old paint have remained visible even as the new additions were being made? We do not have the answers to such questions. And yet, what we do know is significant. While the pigments used and the motifs applied remain within a narrow range, the actual placement of the painting differs from piece to piece. These are no cookie-cutter colored objects. Instead, we are most probably looking at performative objects. Whatever these sculptures did to their viewers, they did it in conjunction with storytelling, with perhaps elaborate rituals of painting them, and perhaps even rituals of breaking them. In the case of our mysterious head fragment at the exhibition, a closer look suggests that it too was painted at one time. A ghost of a left eye peeks even through the photographs, and perhaps there's also one on the right, asymmetrically placed. So this might be an eye, and then perhaps there's another one, sort of more diagonally placed on the right. We do not know how the sculpture would have been activated, so to speak, brought to life in the course of the lifetime of the person with whom it was associated. This eyeless, mouthless, still figure would perhaps have come to life in the act of painting it. And perhaps its fragmentary state is not an evidence of the ravages of time, but the result of a deliberate act of smashing that happened at some point in the life of the specific person or people to whom it was attached, concluding a phase, perhaps initiating another one in the process. There are other pieces in our exhibition where we have a better understanding of the context to which they belong. This piece depicting the dancing child Krishna is an apt example. It was made in Tamil Nadu in southern India in the 13th century. Now, in the Hindu tradition, Krishna is one of the 10 manifestations of the god Vishnu on earth. While Vishnu is the supreme deity, his avatars are sent to the earth for the protection of the good and for the destruction of evil, as one sacred text puts it. As one of Vishnu's manifestations on earth, the life and romantic exploits of Krishna remained a favorite theme in Indian art and literature for centuries. He was raised by humble foster parents in a cow-herding village near the forest of Vrindavan. He spent much of his youth enchanting the female cowherds called the Gopis with the otherworldly sounds of his flute playing. One particular episode from Krishna's childhood, as narrated by the sacred text Bhagavata Purana, is of interest here as we look at our sculpture of the dancing figure. As a child, Krishna revealed his divinity to his people when he vanquished the poisonous serpent Kaliya that lived in the Yamuna river by dancing on him. This is Bhagavata Purana. Quote, "In the Kalindi, there was a certain pool where Kaliya, as the serpent was called, resided, and its water boiled because of the fire of his poison. Birds flying over it would fall dead into its waters. All plant and animal life on the shore died because it came into contact with the poisonous vapor that by the wind was carried from the waves. Krishna had descended to subdue the wicked one. Seeing how severely the river was contaminated by the terribly effective, powerful poison, he climbed in a kadamba tree, slapped his arms, tightened his belt, and jumped into the poisonous water." End of quote. What happens afterwards is an epic battle. The giant snake with 101 heads attacks Krishna, bites him in the chest, and envelopes him in his coil, even as Krishna remains calm and smiles. In the meanwhile, those running to the great commotion in the water see Krishna immobilized in the snake's giant coils and fear for his life. Not only Krishna's family and friends, but even the cows cried loudly in distress. Upon seeing the grief of his loved ones, Krishna releases himself from the grip of the serpent. Eventually, wearing down the serpent, he climbs over its many heads and begins dancing. And this is how the text describes it. Krishna thereupon climbed on top of the broad heads, and then, as the original one, the first spiritual master of all the arts, started to dance. His lotus feet, in touch with the snake, therewith turned red from the light of the many jewels on the head. That very moment, his servants arrived together with their wives, the heavenly singers and perfected souls, the sages and the venerable ones. Taking notice of him being engaged in his dancing, they all were greatly pleased and expressed their joy with playing two-sided clay drums, smaller drums and large drums, and with songs, flowers, and other forms of praise. Whichever of Kaliya's 101 heads would not bow down were immediately trampled down by Krishna. The Lord, who with his kicking feet punishes the evil ones, made the serpent that still moved, but the life of which ran at its end, spit horrible poisonous blood from its mouth and nostrils, while it experienced the greatest anguish. Poison oozed from his eyes, and whichever vomiting head that he, breathing heavily in his anger, would rise, Krishna, while dancing, with his foot forced down into submission. Every time that happened, he with flowers was worshipped for being the original person. End of quote. Now, the narrative in these texts gives us in depth the various states of the participants as the events unfold in time. Kaliya's double-pointed tongue moving between his two lips, poison oozing painfully from his eyes, are all described in detail, bringing this mythical event to the real time of the reader. While the text relates in detail the participants, the setting, and the progress of events, sculpture, a fundamentally static object that shares the three-dimensional physical space of the viewer, has other and completely different resources in its power. Here, we see Krishna standing in perfect balance on his left foot. Under this foot is a small oblong piece of metal. His right leg is bent from knee and hovering midway in air. His left hand is stretched out, right hand extended. His head, carrying a large crown, stands solidly atop his strong neck. Calm, with a slight smile, he is suspended in the midst of his dance. There is no sign of the 101-headed giant serpent being trampled under Krishna, save for that little piece of metal under his left foot. We are no longer second-hand receivers of Krishna's exploits and victories, but are asked to participate. Our imagination, provided that it is familiar with the story, is invited to meet the sculpture halfway to populate what is implied but not depicted for us. The kicking, the dancing, the music, the final collapse of the snake. We are thus transported into the action of the scene. His right palm is raised in a gesture of fearlessness, reassuring and comforting his devotees. In the Bhagavata Purana, Krishna seeks to comfort his loved ones gathered by the Yamuna river to watch him tackle Kaliya. Here, at the present moment, it is us, the viewers, the dancing child Krishna comforts and reassures. Sculpture brings mythical time into the real time of viewing. While today we see this work standing aloof behind the glass case in the exhibition, it in fact belongs to a tradition of portable metal icons that would have been carried in processions. In South India, beginning in the early centuries of the first millennium CE and continuing until present, periodically held religious festivals called utsavas have found their most spectacular expressions in annual parades. Our sculpture belongs to a group of festival objects called Utsava Murti, movable images of gods and saints paraded during temple festivals. Such small-scale metal sculptures would function as temporary vessels for the primary deity of a temple, who actually resided in the immovable images installed inside the temple. In order to be able to act on behalf of the primary images in the temple, these small sculptures would need to be empowered through specific rituals. Furthermore, they would be paraded on daily, weekly, or monthly ceremonies within the temple compound to receive offerings, to be washed, and be adorned. Once a year, they would leave the temple compounds to participate in a festival procession. We can only imagine our sculpture in the exhibition, garlanded, perhaps wrapped in precious textiles and in motion. The people and the spaces through which the procession passes would become charged, transformed. Not unlike Bhagavata Purana's depiction of Krishna's dancing victory over Kaliya, the sculpture in the procession would prompt singers, music, songs, flowers, and praises, transporting the festival participants back into mythical time. There are other pieces as well in our exhibition that would have charged and transformed their environments by participating in and generating multisensorial experiences that unfolded in time. We have already discussed the possible rituals in which our cycladic folded arm figurine might have participated. Another Krishna, this time a much smaller one, is from the 17th century. It shows our hero playing the flute, although this accessory is lost today. Different than the processional function of our dancing child Krishna, this tiny figure would have inhabited a home shrine. Meticulously detailed in the round, the piece shows the god playing his bamboo flute once held in his upraised hands. The small dimensions of the figurine and the intricacy of its details encourage the viewer to study it closely. Once we view it from multiple angles, the delicate bend of his neck and hips and the bend in his knee create an illusion of motion. As we walk around it, we can almost imagine that his body sways to music and his legs begin to move. It's the motion of our body that imbues the sculpture with the semblance of motion in return. In its small dimensions and lifelikeness, our Krishna the Flute Player is similar to another small sculpture exhibited just nearby, the Oletris from the early Roman Empire. Representing a female singer and entertainer in an ancient Greek symposium, this piece would have evoked for its Roman owners a drinking party for aristocratic Greek males that had originated in the 7th century BC. Just like Krishna, she has also lost her instruments. In this case, she would have held a double flute named aulos. And similar to Krishna, she too is delicately detailed, inviting the viewer for a close and extended study. It was adorned with additional accessories. In addition to her musical instrument, she wore silver earrings and bracelets. Similar to the artist who modeled Krishna, Oletris's maker also aimed for an asymmetric composition to create a dynamic viewing experience. The intricate folds of her skirt swirl with the illusionary speed of her motion, and her arms hold the flute at different heights. So different angles reveal and conceal various aspects of the figure from different viewpoints. As we engage with the small figure at this close, extended, and intimate level, her motion entices us to move our body around her in order to follow her dance. As we interact with her in this way, the stationary object comes to life, transporting us in return to a mythical past. Coming back to our Krishna the Flute Player, Bhagavata Purana is once again our source for understanding the iconography of this figure. Living the life of a humble cowherd with his adoptive family, Krishna spent much of his youth enchanting those around him with music he played on his bamboo flute. This is from the Bhagavata Purana. Quote, "The Gopis said, 'The cows raise their ears high to catch with those cups the nectar of the sounds emitted by Krishna holding the flute to his mouth. The cows, with mouths full of the milk that exuded from the udder, stand silently. Within their eyes and hearts Govinda, who moves them and fills their eyes with tears. Dear sisters, the birds in the forest rising to the branches of the trees, beautiful with creepers and twigs, sit there like great sages in their eagerness to see Krishna. With their eyes closed, they listen to the sweet vibrations produced by his flute that silences other voices. With the vibrations of the sweet tones of their flutes, O friends, they therewith wondrously stunt the living entities that can move, while they move the otherwise immobile trees to ecstasy." End of quote. Krishna's enchanted flute, therefore, not only touched the infatuated gopis, but even the forest creatures and the trees, all of whom lost themselves in bliss. Now, the most interesting passages relate to the gopis' reaction to the song of Krishna's flute. When the ladies of Vraja heard the song of the flute that brought to mind the flourishing of all existence, each of them revealed to her intimate companions her appreciation for Krishna not being visible before their eyes. But once they started that description, they, remembering Krishna's deeds and getting excited in rapt attention, could no longer continue. Before their mind's eye, they pictured him with a peacock feather on his head, a body like that of the best dancers, a blue Karnikara lotus behind his ears, golden yellow-colored garments, and the Vaijayanti garland around his neck. The gopis picturing for each other the pastimes of the Supreme Lord, the way he wandered around in Vrindavana, thus being engaged, fully became absorbed in him. End of quote. Now, what I find significant about this passage is that the sound of Krishna's flute miraculously succeeded in materializing the God's image in the minds of his devotees. Now, if the sound emanating from the flute has the power to evoke the absent Krishna as present, what power might our small sculpture have in inducing an experience of divine presence? An 18th century watercolor shows Krishna and the gopis playing music and dancing for one another. At the top of the page on the left, we see Krishna honoring a gopi by dancing for her. To their right, this time we see the gopi dancing for Krishna. At the bottom right, Krishna enchants the gopi with his flute, while to their left, the gopi plays a string instrument as Krishna honors her in a venerating posture, prostrating in front of her. The scene illustrates Krishna's statement that real love must be reciprocal. Just as devotees cherish a deity and long for a divine communion with him, so should Krishna be devoted to his followers. With all this in mind, it's interesting to imagine our tiny Krishna, the flutist cowherd, in a home shrine setting. The medium of sculpture gives him material existence. The home rituals would involve pujas, namely ritual acts in order to invoke the deity. These rituals would be performed at household shrines predominantly by women. These rites would begin with a ritual awakening of the effigy, to be followed by bathing in holy water from a sacred water source, and subsequently the statue would be anointed by a series of substances, and then washed again to enhance its purity. Some of the sculptures depicting Krishna the flutist, such as the 18th century piece from Bengal we see on the screen, come with empty eye sockets that would be filled with paste as part of the ritual. The viewer and the sculptor are in a symbiotic relationship, much like Krishna and his devotees are in a constantly self-reinforcing bond of devotion. Just as the sound of Krishna's flute brought his image to the mind of the gopis, interacting with a sculpted effigy in the context of the daily home rituals transforms the viewer into a devotee, and perhaps trigger her to hearing the playing of the flute, or at least sensing its sweet vibrations, as the sacred text puts it, akin to the forest creatures and the gopis. And the viewer has an experience of the divine. Coming closer to our times, we have other pieces that demanded an interactive context in order to come alive. Case in point is this two-faced female bust from the rural Segu region in Mali in Africa, where there is an extensive masquerade tradition as a popular form of entertainment. Our bust is in fact a life-size masquerade puppet. It belongs to a type that was invented in the 1930s. Falling out of use after a period of widespread popularity, it left its place to other puppets speaking the immediate experiences of local communities. In their lives, such outmoded puppets became collectible fine art objects. While here in the museum context it is presented on a pedestal, originally it would have been fastened to a rod, it would have been dressed up, and it would have featured in a theatrical performance alongside actors, other puppets, and masks. However, even static objects charge their spaces and engage their viewers in theatrical scenarios. The most imaginative ones even thrust our bodies into motion in space. An apt example of that is the 19th century English artist Frederick Leighton's Athlete Wrestling with a Python. What we are asked to witness is nothing less than a battle to death between a man and a giant serpent. The figurine in our exhibition is actually a reduced version of a life-size bronze exhibited by the artist at the Royal Academy in London in 1877. So the life-size figure itself, today there's a copy of it at the Tate collection, so I'm giving you a photograph of the figure in context, and this is a close-up again of the life-size figure. The snake, as you can see, has tightly wrapped its coils around the man's legs. In turn, the man has gripped the serpent by the throat, squeezing it tight. Mouth open and fangs bared, the animal flickers its tongue in fury and desperation. At that time, Leighton had already been famous as a painter, and the appearance of the striking life-size sculpture had nothing less than a bombshell effect in English art. This piece was something brand new under the sun in England. Son of a wealthy medical doctor, Leighton grew up traveling all across Europe and received a thorough education not only in the classics, languages, and art, but also in anatomy. As early as in his teens, he had been instructed by his father to draw the human body from anatomical prints and had quickly become expert enough to reproduce the muscles, bones, and joints from memory with absolute fidelity. The detailed musculature of the male figure demonstrates the facility with which the artist could create a convincing human form. Reminiscent of, and yet not slavishly mimicking any surviving classical sculpture, Leighton's Athlete Wrestling with a Python became a clarion call for the modernization of sculpture in England. Capitalizing on the fame garnered by Leighton's life-size sculpture exhibited in 1877, small-scale versions like ours were produced in multiple editions. Such reductions made sculpture both affordable and practical for display in Victorian domestic interiors. Now, let's look at the Leighton once again to understand why it was so revolutionary for its times. Most important classical pieces, such as the Hellenistic Laocoon, with which Leighton's piece is in competition, often favored a single angle from which the viewer could take in the story narrated in the piece. Leighton's Athlete, on the other hand, frustrates the viewer who looks at it from a single viewpoint. The athletes and the python's faces diametrically oppose one another, which means that it is absolutely impossible for the viewer to see the faces of the opponents engaged in this dramatic confrontation at one and the same time. We have to change our position, we have to move if we want to see their faces. The sculpture requires us to move around in a spiral, not unlike the coils of the snake that has enfolded the athlete, and become immersed in its detailed surface. Realistic touches such as the scales of the reptile and the bulging veins of the athlete are all calculated to engage our imagination in the battle unfolding before our eyes. Another piece in our show that prompts the viewer to be perpetually in motion is the American sculptor Milena Hoffman's depiction of the acclaimed Russian ballet dancers Anna Pavlova and Loran Novikov. When Hoffman's path crossed with Pavlova's in 1913, the ballerina had already acquired worldwide fame. Her stellar beginnings at the Mariinsky Ballet in St. Petersburg led her to international fame, as she became one of the stars of the Russian impresario Sergei Diaghilev's Ballet Russe that took Paris by storm in 1909. Hoffman's sculpture shows Pavlova and Novikov in a ballet first staged on October 6, 1913 in London, first named Oriental Fantasy, and then later on came to be known simply as Oriental. The ballet was specifically composed for the famous ballerina in honor of her 2 farewell performances in London, as she prepared to embark on an extended tour with her own company across the US. Russian artist Leon Bakst had designed the costumes and the setting. Set in a mythical time in the exotic Orient, the ballet tells the story of a young knight who has just returned from the wars, bearing a talisman to guard him against misfortune. And yet, the talisman almost fails to protect him from falling in love with a dangerous enchantress, danced by Pavlova, who tries unsuccessfully to lure him to destruction. On the screen, we see Leon Bach's costume for Novikov. Pavlova herself seems to have been scantily dressed. One critic described her as a whirling flash of animation, crimson and gold radiating from her, in a costume of such cobweb texture that the 7 veils of Salome are Arctic furs in comparison. From the published descriptions of it, it seems that the choreography was highly sensual. While the London audiences cheered themselves hoarse, at least one dance critic found its eroticism offensive. Here's this critic, quote, "There was too much practical allurement shown by this Eastern enchantress in her desire to possess the young knight's talisman. One need not be a prude to object to the public embraces which are considered necessary in Russian ballets when dealing with Eastern subjects. The Oriental Fantasy is a rather weak example of the decadence which, admire them as one may, runs through these Russian ballets of action." End of quote. Now, we know that Milena Hoffman attended this performance when it was staged in New York in 1913. We have the drawings she jotted in her small notebook as she watched the dancers. The drawings show the sculptor's fascination with the strange shapes of Novikov's costume, especially his headpiece and pointed shoes. The animalistic intensity of the enchantress's passion and her desire for the young warrior was reflected in the choreography. It seems like the rhythm of the ballet began slow, as the enchantress reclined and waited, while her attendees danced languorously, as captured by Hoffman in the sketch in the left. With the appearance of the young knight, the speed must have picked up. The enchantress uncoiled, rose from her throne, and danced a dance of the serpents to the music played by a solo piano. She slithered and coiled like a snake and pranced upon her prey like a tiger. And then the two dancers began a passionate dance. When the piece was staged in the US, one American critic described Pavlova's radically new dancing style in following terms. Instead of play of pretty sentiment and light humor, the enchantress waiting for her passing prey, devoured with desire for it, pursuing it with fierce and sensual temptation, almost possessing it, and indomitable still when it slips from her. A melodrama with passion and fate at odds within it. She didn't caress, she commanded. Power was in the miming and savagery in the dance. Then came the climax when the hand is almost upon the prey, and fierce anticipation played out of her graphic glance and her dancing body. Then the moment of fierce bewilderment when the warrior baffles her. Finally, the slow sinking, with the very voice and line of music into the waiting, indomitable and devouring. Miming of such imagination and intensity, so stark and elemental, is new to our stage, and new as a revelation of a power in Pavlova that hitherto she has hidden. The same critic describes a powerful multisensorial experience of watching the piece in the theater. Bach carried the eye and the imagination into the enchantress's chamber. Instead of a neutral setting, the play of Bach's hot, broad color over a close-walled oriental chamber, remote, solitary, perfume-laden, voluptuous in its every suggestion. Instead of merely incidental dresses, costumes that were part and parcel of this play of color and implication. Instead of conventionalized music, music out of the Russians that was as highly colored as the settings, that ran to sharp, wild rhythms, that bore passion and whipped it. Now, the critics' referral to the smell of perfumes wasn't just a turn of phrase. The audiences were indeed hit by the smell of incense that gradually permeated the theater. By the same token, the music was gathered from the works of great Russian composers Alexander Serov, Modest Mussorgsky, and Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. The colors, the costumes, the passionate music, and stylized, highly gestural dances all combined to create an experience for the spectators. Going back to the sketches Hoffman made as she watched the ballet on the stage, we see that in almost all of them, except for one, the knight lifts the enchantress, her face turned away from him. The one drawing that I'm showing on the right that breaks this pattern is the one that might have inspired the composition of the sculpture. In this drawing, the knight again holds the enchantress at her waist. This time she faces him. Her straight arm seems to pull his face towards herself, while his straight back resists this pull. The tension between the two, the battle of their wills, is tangible in the drawing. The sculpture has a completely different spirit. Here, Pavlova has let go of her arms and indeed seems to have let go of herself. Her mouth is half open, her arms are stretched toward the ground, her left toe barely touches the earth, while her right leg is lifted, gently pressing on Novikov's leg. He, in his turn, looks down at her with a gentle expression. While in the ballet the couple's passion was not consummated, and the man saved himself from the clutches of the enchantress in the nick of time, in the sculpture we have something more akin to the release of pleasure. Indeed, the moment depicted in Hoffman's sculpture is the one in which frantic action culminates in a moment of collapse, of ecstatic exhaustion. Here Hoffman has made a puzzling choice. The sculpture is indeed far away from triggering an experience of the exotic shapes, colors, smells, dangerous and yet titillating sensations, and the uncanny bodies of the ballet. The performance on the stage appealed to multiple senses, to the eye, the ear, and even to the sense of smell. It was fast, it unfolded in time. It whipped up the spectator in the intensity and excitement of the emotions depicted. Hoffman knew that the static three-dimensional materiality of sculpture couldn't and wouldn't compete with the ballet's assault to senses. Instead, her sculpture aims for something completely different, although, as we shall see, it is equally sexually charged as the ballet. Gone are the exotic costumes, bright colors. By the same token, there is no music, neither can we smell any perfumes emanating from the scene of action. Instead, the artist here has reflected on what sculpture can do, what specifically the medium of sculpture can do. And what it can do is to allow the viewer to take charge rather than be overrun by the performance. This is a moment of quiet and reflection, and even meditation, as we are absorbed in looking at these two figures who are in turn being absorbed in the passion they feel for one another. As we stand in front of the sculpture, as we walk around it to see the intricate shapes of these two intertwined bodies from multiple angles, we are immersed in an extended experience of silence. We become privileged intruders into this moment of intimacy between two people that is suspended in space and time. All the slides I showed you in this lecture are not the artworks themselves, but they're photographs, they're representations of the sculptures. To experience the actual sculpture, you need to be in front of them. You need to take them in, you need to walk around them. I think it's certainly very true for this piece. I am very unpleased with the photographs that I'm showing you here, but no matter how many photographs I take, this experience of seeing these bodies intertwined, metamorphosing into one another, cannot really be captured in the still representation. You have to be there in person looking at this piece to really see what I'm trying to explain. Going back to the question, what do sculptures do? It may seem that pieces like Hoffman's and Leighton's are eons away from the world of our Cycladic head, or even from the dancing and flute-playing Krishnas. It seems that sculpture no longer connects the land of the living and the land of the dead. Neither does it communion with the divine. Instead, it has become deeply personal, deeply intimate. That may be true, but at one level, all experience of all of these pieces are deeply personal and deeply intimate. One thing that is common to all of these pieces is a fundamental element of the art of sculpture. Although sculptures are all three-dimensional objects existing on the same physical plane as the viewer, they remove their viewers from the familiarity of the everyday surroundings. They trigger highly charged experiences of space and time. The viewer, by engaging with sculpture, enters into an alternative reality. All of these pieces are adamant that we look at them. If possible, we handle them even, we hold them in our hands. We take them in from multiple angles, from the back, from the side, from the front, but also from below and from above. I will conclude by inviting you to the galleries to see the show if you haven't done so already. Take your time and immerse yourselves in the process of looking and experience for yourselves the enchantment of being transported. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions or to hear your comments or your thoughts or ideas. Yes?
I heartily agree with your statement that you can't see art unless you're actually in front of the object, not just a reproduction in a book or however fine that is. But I also love the installation and the way the sculptures talk to each other through time. The different heads, different parts of the body, or different actions that the human form can engage in. And I imagine that was maybe a fun part of putting this together, the relationship between these different objects.
Absolutely. That was something that was at the heart of how we thought about this from the beginning, rather than let's say giving a chronological overview. What we wanted to tell was exactly these objects, even if they were made at completely different times, different places, using different procedures, have also certain commonalities. You know, some artists, certainly the much later artists, are aware of the earlier pieces, so there is a self-conscious element of emulation. But beyond that, there seems to be a commonality to shared human experience that gets expressed in these variations and these hundreds of different variations. So yes, thank you for that comment. Ike, did you want to add something to it since you did the installation?
Well, just, you know, it's interesting if you are a museum professional and you're used to art storage, and Mary, you've been in many areas of the museum, including art storage, there's a certain chaos that is inherent to all art storage because people don't give you things in chronological order. They give you things that they have, so there's a randomness. And in a way, what the installation does is capture a little bit of that element of randomness as opposed to a more, how should one say, enlightenment approach to classification, where everything is ordered, whether by a certain type of iconography, a certain type of object. But throwing things into a certain pell-mell array does elicit hugely interesting, I think, associations in many different directions that are in some ways more provocative and can sometimes make you see objects in very different ways. So I'm not suggesting that there was anything really accidental in the end to the way that we installed the objects. Rather, we took an enormous amount of time to see how they would play off of one another. But it is unusual for a museum to take this approach, largely because we live in a different age of categorization right now, and museums have tried to be responsible in their approach to the encyclopedic, which is very much an Enlightenment notion. But you know, experimentation with your permanent collection, if you want to experiment, that's where you can do it for sure. And we wanted to take advantage of that. That and Gülru's imagination, because as you can see, she has a wonderful way of activating inanimate objects and making you see them with a certain passion that perhaps people who aren't familiar with the medium don't naturally bring to it. Does anybody else have any other questions? You're not going to ask me why these things are moving in the installation? I thought that was an obvious.
Why are these things moving in that?
Well, that was sort of a little pipe dream that we kind of had. I think Gülru's actually done this before in other installations, but because visitors, viewers generally are so used to two-dimensional imagery, they aren't by force of habit understanding the interest in the round that a work of sculpture presents. So in a way, by making them literally turn in space, you're forcing the issue. And we're not beyond manipulating visitors into attending to objects because, as you all know, in the digital age, we have an attention span of 3 seconds or whatever it is. So there are several little tricks that we use. We also used a fader in the wall of heads, as we affectionately refer to it. So if you stare at one of those sculptures, you'll notice that the intensity of the light actually shifts very slowly over time. And that was, again, a way of trying to get the viewer to actually engage with the object and look at it for a longer period of time. I think that attention and the history of attention is a very understudied subject, and right now we're living in a sort of crisis because our habits of attention have drifted so violently in terms of the momentary that it's very hard for us to know how to engage with objects produced in a different era where attention span was literally a completely different experience. It's sort of the difference between being able to actually get through all of Tolstoy's War and Peace and find it satisfying and torturing yourself with the fact that you can't get past the first 10 pages because your attention span isn't good enough to sustain the imagination of a writer who felt like he had to give you every detail of every scene with such fidelity that you as a normal modern viewer fall asleep. Now, I'm not saying that he's a bad writer. I'm saying that we don't know how to read Tolstoy anymore. So you have to sort of put yourself back in time and recapture those habits of attention to allow the piece of fiction to do its work. And so that's what you in the museum world do routinely, is we're trying to transport you back to different eras frequently and have you engage with objects the way that those makers and viewers engaged with those objects. So it in itself is a fiction and a fantasy and a kind of theater. Whether or not we're successful, it's another question, because you're fighting the onslaught of a digital age that has markedly changed your circuitry, even in your brain, so that you're not really seeing things the way that people did in the 19th century, let alone the 18th century, let alone according to the Cyclades. We don't even know who those people were, right? So anyway, those kinds of things, I think, come into play in a kind of installation like this one. And so it's really, I think, refreshing, I find, to have objects presented in this way.
I really appreciated the subtlety of the four lights moving across the heads, because it's a bit frustrating knowing I couldn't walk around them, yet it gave me many different views because of that, especially when you're looking at a piece like the Nadelman, that the marble was chosen specifically for the light that was allowed to penetrate, that gave that waxy look. So when you look to her, you see her in 4 different forms, really, because of the way the lights switch over, and it's not too slow. So you can, in a very short period of time, see that, but I think that was genius.
I wanted to ask you about the Milena Hoffman, because we were studying it at some length when we were trying to check the condition of the object. And there is an interesting thing about the patina.
Right.
So if you look at that object
Yeah,
really
here.
closely,
I think this is very good.
You see this little bit of red pigment
Here.
And, we had a conservator look at it, and I don't think that that's a sign of any kind of erosion. Rather, I wonder
Here,
whether
in
or
his
not
side.
it is a very deliberate effect that, again, would allude to what you were describing about the sensual quality. There's a sort of molten sensation that you get in looking at what normally is a cold, certainly, you know what bronze feels like, it's cold. But there's a certain warmth that is imparted by those little eruptions of red that, I kind of think they
were very deliberate on your part.
There was a piece in my talk that I took out in the interest of time in which I was talking exactly about that actually. So yes, certainly if you look at the piece, as Ike says, red seems to be almost sort of bleeding out. And it's made me think actually of all people, Eugène Delacroix's paintings. In some of his paintings, you're going to see the sort of red background bleeding out, for example, in the Death of Sardanapalus, even though where you don't really see much blood, but blood needs to be evoked, so it's this red background that peeks out here and then, and that triggers your imagination to think that you're seeing actual blood. And in here, I absolutely agree with you. I think while the sculpture is really eliminating the costume, the drama, and everything else, it's keeping the intensity and maybe the danger and the uncanniness of these emotions that are being controlled or bursting out with this color reds. I absolutely agree with you. Yeah. And it's, once you spot it, it's really hard to unsee, and it's in very interesting places. It's in his ear. There's a lot of it here on the ground. It's under her toe. But I think it also guides your eye. It choreographs your viewing as well. It tells you where to look. Sorry, I'm trying to find this one particular one. Here, for example, as you bend in front of the sculpture and look under it, what you're going to see is her back is red, and he's holding herself very tightly there. It's as if it's bleeding or bursting with fire. So, once you start picking on it, you basically need to put yourself in strange positions and make the guards rather nervous in order to follow what else is happening there. And as that happens, so some of these things cannot be captured really in the stillness of photography itself. Things start opening up, right?
Anybody else have any questions? If not, then I hope you'll go upstairs and look again at Milena Hoffman and everything else that's up there. And thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us.
Thank you very much.